It's kind of wild how some problems just never seem to go away,
Yeah.
Like we're talking about cocaine production in Colombia. It just hit a record high for the 10th year in a row. It's
Well,
crazy. Like, you think with all the efforts to combat it, things would be getting better, not worse.
yeah, it's definitely a perplexing situation.
2,664 tons of cocaine were produced in 2023 alone.
A 52% increase from the year before. It really makes you wonder why this industry is booming when, logically, it should be declining.
Exactly. So let's dive into this Italian news article we found and try to figure out what's going on. What makes this whole thing even more mind-boggling are the sheer numbers involved.
Oh, absolutely. To really grasp the scale of this, we got to put those 2,664 tons into perspective. Imagine 26 Olympic-sized swimming pools, all filled to the brim with cocaine. That's how much we're talking about.
Wow, that's a that's a lot of cocaine.
And the land they're using to grow coca, the plant that cocaine comes from, also expanded by 10%, reaching 253,000 hectares. Picture an area 3 times the size of New York City.
Those numbers are just staggering. I mean, we constantly hear about the war on drugs, but it seems like something isn't working. Why is Colombia, despite all its efforts, failing to curb this growth? What's the root of this problem?
Well, to understand that, we need to go back in time, way back to how Colombia became the world's leading coca producer in the first place.
Okay, so like a historical context kind of thing.
Exactly. The 1970s saw the emergence of those notorious Medellin and Cali cartels, marking the beginning of Colombia's deep dive into the drug trade.
Right, those names are practically synonymous with the cocaine trade.
And then in the 1980s came the U.S.-funded war on drugs, aiming to eradicate the problem. But while this approach unfortunately cost countless lives, it didn't actually stop the trade.
You could even argue it made things worse, fueled more violence and instability.
Right, definitely added fuel to the fire.
This article we're looking at really highlights the fragility of the Colombian state as a key factor in all of this. What exactly does that mean?
Basically, the Colombian government, for a whole bunch of reasons, has trouble exerting control in many areas, especially in the more rural, remote regions. And, nature abhors a vacuum. So this void was quickly filled by various armed groups.
Groups like the FARC, right? The Revolutionary
Yeah.
Armed Forces of Colombia.
Yeah, FARC is a major player, a leftist guerrilla group, and then you've got the right-wing paramilitaries like the United Self-Defense Forces of Colombia, or AUC.
So both sides of the political spectrum saw the drug trade as a way to make money and gain power.
Exactly. They used it to fund their operations, furthering the instability in the country.
And wasn't there a point where the AUC got directly involved in cocaine production, like in the late 1990s?
Oh, absolutely. That was a total game changer. When the AUC started directly managing the production, coca cultivation just exploded.
Exploded how much?
It surged from around 13,000 hectares in the 1980s to over 80,000 hectares in 1998.
So in just 10 years, it increased sixfold.
Bam.
This economic power they gained from this, it allowed them to solidify their control and influence even more. They basically became a state within a state.
Pretty much. Undermining the rule of law, creating a climate of fear, it was a dark time.
And they had some pretty interesting tactics for maintaining control too, right? This article mentions something about a tax on coca base.
Yeah, they called it the grammage tax. Basically, they slapped a tax on every single gram of coca base produced in their territory. It was ingenious and brutal at the same time.
It's almost like they created their own shadow economy. So not only were they producing and trafficking cocaine, but they were also taxing it.
Precisely. A brilliant, albeit ruthless, business model.
That must have brought in a ton of cash for them.
You bet it did. And that money went straight into buying weapons, recruiting fighters, and basically cementing their power even further. Plus, it kind of forced farmers to grow even more coca to meet their demands.
Wow. So it wasn't just about violence and intimidation. It was about building this whole parallel economic system, like a state within a state.
Right, a shadow state. A dark mirror to the legitimate economy, funded entirely by cocaine. And the crazy thing is how much money this shadow economy actually generates.
Yeah, what kind of figures are we talking about here?
Well, this article estimates the cocaine trade in 2023 alone brought in about $7 billion.
$7 billion. With a B. That's insane.
It is. And to put that in perspective, Colombia's legal oil export revenue, their main source of income, was around $16 billion.
So cocaine is like almost half as big as their oil industry.
Exactly. It's become a major player in the Colombian economy, whether they like it or not.
It's kind of disturbing to think about, right? Like a dark reflection of the legitimate economy.
It really is. It's got its own supply chains, its own distribution networks, and even like its own brutal form of law enforcement.
Driven by violence and fear.
Exactly. And all that economic power makes it that much harder to dismantle. It fuels corruption, weakens the government, and just makes everything so much more difficult.
It's like a vicious cycle feeding on itself.
Pretty much.
And on top of all that, even the efforts to eradicate coca production haven't been very successful. This article mentioned how the suspension of aerial glyphosate spraying in 2015 actually kind of backfired.
Oh, yeah. That was a tough lesson learned.
What happened?
So they halted the spraying because of all the health and environmental concerns, which is understandable, right? Glyphosate is some nasty stuff.
Yeah, definitely controversial.
But the very next year, coca cultivation shot up by a crazy 52%. It just goes to show how resilient and adaptive this whole industry is.
So like whack-a-mole.
Yeah,
You knock it down in one place, it just pops up somewhere else.
exactly. It's a constantly evolving beast.
So if aerial spraying isn't the answer, what about the other eradication efforts, like manually uprooting the coca plants, destroying labs, seizing shipments? Has any of that worked?
Well, those are all important parts of the strategy for sure. But unfortunately, they just haven't been enough to make a real dent in the problem.
Right.
Because think about it. As long as that demand is out there and those profits are so high, someone somewhere will find a way to produce and transport cocaine. It's like a law of physics almost.
It's like trying to hold back a tidal wave with a broom,
Pretty much.
which leads us to the other side of the equation, the demand. This article pointed out that while cocaine use in the U.S. is actually going down, it's exploding in Europe and Oceania.
That's a huge factor. You can't just focus on the supply side. Demand plays a huge role in all of this.
So we've got this growing global market in places like, what was it, the UK, Belgium, Netherlands, France, Australia, New Zealand. And that just keeps the whole system going.
It makes the trade too profitable. It doesn't matter how hard governments try to crack down on production. If demand is there, someone will find a way to meet it.
So we're dealing with this multifaceted problem with no easy answers. We've tried tackling the supply. We've seen how demand is a huge driver. Where does that leave Colombia? Can they ever truly escape this grip of the drug trade?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? With cocaine production at record highs and global demand going up, it's a daunting challenge, to say the least.
It feels kind of hopeless almost.
I wouldn't say hopeless, but it's definitely going to take some serious outside-the-box thinking. Eradication efforts alone clearly aren't enough.
So what else can they do? What are we missing here?
Well, this article didn't really dive into specific alternative solutions, but if we take a step back and look at the bigger picture, it's clear this isn't just about drugs. This is about economics, about politics, about the very fabric of Colombian society.
So maybe instead of focusing so much on eradication, we need to be thinking about what? Alternative development strategies.
Exactly. Invest in rural development, create legitimate economic opportunities for the people who rely on coca cultivation right now, address poverty, strengthen governance, make the drug trade less appealing.
So instead of just cutting off the head of the hydra, dry up the swamp it lives in.
Precisely.
Address the root causes, not just the symptoms.
It's not going to be easy. It's a complex problem that demands a multifaceted approach. But it's not impossible.
It's really kind of crazy to think about how intertwined this whole cocaine trade is with the Colombian economy. Like, they've spent billions, literally billions, on trying to fight it, and yet it's still thriving. It really makes you wonder if we're even fighting the right battle.
It's like this whole balloon effect thing we talked about,
Yeah.
You squeeze in one area, like with the aerial spraying, and it just pops up somewhere else. This industry is relentless, man. It just adapts.
Speaking of adapting, you mentioned earlier how the AUC, those paramilitaries, they actually imposed a tax on coca production.
Oh, yeah, the grammage.
Right, the grammage. It's like they created their own little tax system in the areas they controlled. What does that tell us about how effective our traditional approaches are, like law enforcement and eradication?
Well, it just shows you how when the state is weak, when institutions are fragile, it creates this vacuum. And criminal organizations, they're more than happy to fill that void. They create their own systems, their own rules, often brutally enforced. It just further undermines any legitimate authority.
It's like they become the government.
Pretty much. And that makes it so much harder to actually solve the problem.
Because you're not just fighting a criminal organization at that point, you're fighting a shadow state.
Exactly. And that's why it's not enough to just focus on eliminating crops. You have to strengthen the rule of law. You have to give people viable alternative, a way out of this cycle.
And this Italian news article really drives home the point that this isn't just a Colombian problem, right?
Yeah, not at all.
With demand in Europe and Oceania booming, it's a global issue.
100%.
It requires a global solution.
If we really want to tackle this, we can't just focus on what's happening in Colombia. We have to look at the demand side. We have to reduce demand in those countries. And that means education. It means addressing the socioeconomic factors that lead to drug use in the first place. It's a much bigger conversation.
So we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. The historical context, the economics, the politics, the global demand. It's a lot to process.
It's complex.
Incredibly complex.
Right.
And it's clear there's no easy fix. But maybe, just maybe, by understanding how deep this problem runs, we can start to imagine better solutions, more holistic ones.
I think that's the key. We need a real shift in perspective, moving away from this sole focus on eradication and embracing a more nuanced approach, combining supply reduction with demand reduction with long-term development strategies.
It's about more than just cutting off the supply. It's about addressing the root causes, the underlying issues. Well, this has been a really eye-opening deep dive, to say the least, a sobering reminder of just how complex this cocaine trade is, and that it's going to take a lot more than just national efforts to solve it. We need global attention, cooperation, and a willingness to think outside the box, to come up with truly innovative solutions. Thanks for joining us in this deep dive. We'll see you next time.